Hello and welcome to Tech Deals. Graphics card performance comparison. We are testing three different graphics cards today. First, the Intel integrated HD630 graphics chip in the 7th generation of Intel processors, the AMD RX 564 GB card, and the NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1050 Ti 4 GB card. The computer used for testing is the $450 Acer Aspire T desktop computer. I've previously reviewed this computer, link to that review in the video description below. Full playlist of videos on this computer, check it out if you're interested. Fraps was used for the game performance numbers you'll see at the end of the video, but it was not used to capture the video. An Elgato HD60S external capture box was used for the video capture, and the numbers in green at the top left of the screen are from MSI Afterburner. Please note that links to the computer system and the two graphics cards are in the video description below to Amazon and Newegg as appropriate. Please check them both, compare prices, and buy it where it makes the most sense to you. Here we are playing Battlefield 4. Now this is the story missions, the campaign, and it's very early in the game. I've not actually played through the entire campaign myself, but what I will tell you is that this is an older game that I would expect to run on lower end hardware, which is why I'm testing it instead of Battlefield 1, which should be more demanding. Now, I did try this at 1080p, but let me be absolutely clear. Even at low detail, Battlefield 4 is not at all smooth at 1080p on the integrated HD630 graphics. That's why the numbers in green in the upper left hand corner are so large. This is 720p. Now I'll show you 1080p on the two add-in cards. If nothing else, this demonstrates that while Intel's integrated graphics have definitely come a long way in the past few years, so have $100 inexpensive graphics cards. To put it another way, the RX 560 that I'm going to show you in a minute is basically a $100 version of the HD 7850, which was a $250 card 5 years ago. AMD has not done a very good job coming out with new top-end graphics cards. What they have done a good job is bringing the price, power consumption, and complexity of cards down to a much lower price point. Now, I know we're showing the HD630, but I'm more talking about the two add-in cards today. The RX 560 is almost exactly an HD 7850, which was launched in the spring of 2012. So 5 years ago, roughly, a $250 card, power consumption is down, cost is down, performance almost exactly the same. So now that's for the 2GB version. I have the 4GB version here, which is 115, but the 2GB version is really all you need for a game such as this. So since the card from 5 years ago is 2 gigs, if you compare like to like, you're looking at $99 for the 2 gig card. Integrated graphics. Now, if you were to compare this HD630 to what Intel had on offer 5 years ago in 2012, the same thing would have happened. Integrated graphics from Intel have increased by orders of magnitude. We're talking 500% increase in graphics performance between 2nd generation Sandy Bridge chips and 7th generation Kaby Lake chips. Now, because everything else has moved along in that time frame, it's not as impressive as that sounds. First of all, we're coming from a very low number. The integrated graphics were useless for 3D performance before. Today, they're a little bit more useful, but still, this was a slideshow and it stuttered and it was completely unplayable at 1080p, which is why we're playing it at 720p. Now I could certainly show you more of that, but let me just say that you'll see the benchmark numbers at the end of this video, but I don't recommend the HD630 integrated graphics for Battlefield 4 in any way, shape, or form. It simply doesn't cut the mustard. Let's move on to the RX 560. Notice the text in the upper left-hand corner. It is much smaller, and that's because we're at 1080p resolution. Now, as I said before, this is the 4GB version of the card, and we're running at high detail. I did leave that up on the screen so that you could in fact see that that's what's set. Notice the world looks nicer. Notice it's sharper and more detailed. Well, depending on what device. If you're watching this on your cell phone with a 4-inch screen, you won't see it. But if you're watching this on a decent desktop monitor, you should notice the difference between the previous graphics and these. Is it smooth and playable? Look at the performance. We're over 60 frames per second. Not bad for a $100 to a $115 graphics card. Now look at line 2. We're using 1.8, almost 1.9 gigabytes of VRAM. Now this is a 4 gigabyte card for $115, but for $99 you can get the 2 gig version of this card, and it will perform exactly the same because frankly this game doesn't need 4 gigs of VRAM. It's not new, it didn't come out yesterday. At 1080p at high detail, it's not an issue. Now I know some people are going to say, but why wouldn't you get the 4 gig card? Then you could play at 1440p, you could turn it up to ultra detail. The card doesn't have the compute power to do that. If you were to put this at 1440p and turn it up to ultra detail, you'd be getting 30 frames per second. Yes, you would need the 4 gigs of VRAM at that point, but then the card can't actually display a playable frame rate, so it's really a moot point. Having said that, if you've watched my other videos comparing these cards and I've said go ahead and buy the 4 gig card, the reason is this is probably not the only game you want to play. There's bound to be at least one game in the next year or two if you want to buy this card that will play on the 4 gig card that will struggle on the 2 gig card. Textures, details, things get updated. Basically, you're looking at a pizza being the price difference between the 2 gig and the 4 gig card. You're looking at dinner for one. Maybe 2 people, depending upon what you spend dinner on, but it's a minor difference. I personally would get the 4 gig card at this point with only a $15 price difference between the two. And that's, of course, unless you find that, if you find the 2 gig card for, say, $79 or something, well, by all means, pick that up. That would be a deal. But if there's only a $15 difference, get the 4 gig card. Main system RAM usage, less than 4 gigs. This game is not new. 8 gigs of RAM is fine for it. Now, if we were playing Battlefield 1, you'd need 16 gigs. Well, you don't need 16 gigs of RAM. I recommend 16 gigs. But, this is Battlefield 4. It's not a stress. CPU usage is fine. This game came out at a time when games didn't use more than 4 cores, so our i5-7400 is just fine. In fact, if you really want to be on a budget, if you want the deal, waiting for games to be 2 years old and playing them on budget hardware will save you a fortune compared to having the latest and greatest games when they first come out. The flip side is if you want to play multiplayer modes. Now, it's true that if you wait, for example, Battlefield 1 has now been out for a little while. If you wait until the next Battlefield game comes out and then you pick up Battlefield 1 on sale, great, awesome, wonderful. Hardware's cheaper, the game's bugs have been fixed, everything's updated, the game will be cheaper. The problem is if you play multiplayer. If you play multiplayer, you kind of do need to get the game early on or you're completely left behind. And some games, a year post-launch, don't even have much of an audience left. So if single player is all that you care about, wait a year. You'll save money on the game, you'll save money on the hardware, win-win. But if you play multiplayer, there's an argument to be said, go ahead and buy it at launch. Yes, you pay a premium, but you get in with everybody else when it's new, and you kind of get to experience it and join groups or join clans or join the large multiplayer engagements, which might not be there a year post-launch. Now, how about the GTX 1050 Ti? Now, this card is on average about $15 more expensive than the 4 gigabyte version of the RX 560. Is it worth it? Well, we'll get to the results in just a minute. One of the considerations is performance per dollar. Performance, how much are you getting per unit of performance? Now, this card costs more, but sometimes spending more does make sense if it gives you enough of a leapfrog of performance to justify that cost. Take a look at our real-time frame rate. We're in exactly the same area of the map. In fact, I played this entire first mission. I'm not showing it to you simply because otherwise this video would be 30 minutes long, and some games deserve 30 minutes. Some games have enough replays or enough information it's worth it. I don't think this is one of them, so I'm going to keep this relatively short. However, I did play through the full first mission, and so the benchmark numbers you'll see at the end was about 45 minutes of total benchmark testing time between the 3 graphics chips, the integrated graphics, and then the 2 dedicated cards. I highly recommend any of these dedicated cards if you're interested in playing Battlefield 4. Now, one question that might come up, given the wonderful frame rates you see here, bouncing around 100 frames per second, is what about the less expensive cards? Now, the GTX 1050 is $99, 2 gigabytes. It's a little bit slower than a 1050 Ti, but it would play this game just fine. If you drop below that, the GT 1030 was just launched, and AMD launched about a month ago their RX 550. Please note that the GT 1030 and the RX 550 are half this performance. They're fine, but they're not meant for this. They're really meant for home theater PCs, low power consumption machines, fanless systems. They're meant for people who want HDMI 2.0 put into an older computer. They will play games. I will show games on them. Please skip those cards if you're interested in gaming. And if Battlefield anything is on your radar screen, skip those. An RX 560 or a GTX 1050 or 1050 Ti should be the minimum you buy in terms of a new card today. The last thing I want to draw your attention to before we switch to the results is the CPU usage. If you actually go back and watch the RX 560 CPU usage and then you watch the CPU usage here, you'll notice something. The usage is higher on this run. Why could that be? Look at the frame rate. Higher frame rates generally require more CPU usage. I've commented this on a variety of videos I've done in the past. But if you are interested in high frame rates, good graphics is not the only thing you need. Now, the only reason we're getting such good frame rates here is because, again, Battlefield 4, older game. But as your frame rate increases, the demand the graphics chip puts on your CPU to generate the environment, to handle the AI, the drawing of all the geometry, a lot of that is actually still done on the CPU. The graphics card doesn't do everything. So as your frame rate scales up, so does your CPU. If you're interested in playing a game such as Battlefield 4 and you want to play it at 140 or maybe even 200 frames a second because you play multiplayer, you play competitive, you have a high refresh rate monitor, this computer actually wouldn't be powerful enough. Your graphics chip would actually be bottlenecked by your CPU. If you have a low-end graphics card, then the reverse is true. So a lot of times when people ask the question, will a graphics card bottlenecked B CPU? Well, that depends. Are you running high resolution, lower refresh rates? Lower resolution, high refresh rates? There's a difference. You can absolutely take a CPU and a graphics card and find a situation where the CPU will bottleneck the graphics card, but then the graphics card will bottleneck the CPU depending upon the game, the resolution, and the refresh rate that you're trying to run at. So it's not so simple to simply say one works with the other. As your frame rate increases, you need more CPU power to keep up with it. As the graphics complexity, resolution, details, etc. increase, then your graphics card has to become more powerful. Frankly, the big limitation to high refresh rates is your CPU more than it is your graphics card. Whereas if you want to turn it to ultra detail and you want high resolutions, that's when you need more powerful graphics. And of course, if you want all of the above, well, then basically you need all the monies and all the computers you can possibly throw at it. For example, if you want to play Ghost Recon Wildlands at ultra detail at 4K, actually that computer doesn't exist yet. Even a GTX 1080 Ti won't do it. High detail is about the best you'll get for 60 frames per second playable at 4K resolution in that game. But it'll come. Probably the next generation of cards will do it. All right, that's enough. Let's look at the results. Integrated graphics, low detail, 720p. Well, let's face it, it's playable, but not great. An average of 50 frames per second with a 1% minimum of 35 and a 0.1% minimum of 27. What are those? Now, the red bars are 1% minimums, not a true minimum, but it drops the bottom 1% of the frames and calls that the minimum. To put it another way, all the red bars, you will get at least that frame rate or better 99% of the time. The blue bars take it out one decimal place 99.9% of the time. So that means that one or two really low frames in a 10-minute benchmark run don't destroy the benchmark charts. It gives you a realistic idea of where the true minimums are. My recommendations are you focus on the red bars, not the blue ones. I think the red bars are more realistic for average play. What about the two add-in cards? 1080p, high detail, 70 frames per second on the RX 560, 103 frames per second on the 1050 Ti. Exact same single player mission, same run through, same length. Compared to many of the multiplayer tests that I've done, these are very consistent and repeatable. The GTX 1050 Ti really is faster than the RX 560. But it costs more. It's worth noting that the 2 gig version of the RX 560 would give you exactly the same performance, but the 1050 non-Ti would not. It is 10 to 15% slower than the Ti. So they're the same price. The 2 gig version of each of the cards is the same price, but the performance of the GTX is slower. Whereas the RX 560 2 gig card would be exactly the same. What about the 1% numbers? Only the GTX 1050 Ti maintains over 60 frames per second 99% of the time, with a 1% minimum of 74 and just under 60 frames per second at 54. The RX 560 doesn't quite get there with a 53 1% number and a 44.1% number. Now the next question is, which card is worth the money? Which one should you buy? This chart is honestly the most interesting in my opinion. What this chart shows you is that the GTX 1050 Ti, at least in Battlefield 4, in this mission, in the story mode, in the campaign, is actually less expensive per unit of performance. You're paying $1.26 per frame per second at $130 for the GTX 1050 Ti versus $1.64 per frame per second on the RX 560. Please note that this is based upon the prices you see on the screen. If you find these cards for a different price, take whatever price you can get them for, because it will change, and divide it by the frame rates you see on the previous page. You'll get a different number. So if you find these cards on sale or mail-in rebates, you can of course recompute. Notice that all three performance benchmarks, the average, the 1% minimum, and the 0.1% minimum, are less expensive on the more expensive card. The 1050 Ti really is faster, and if you're looking for value for the money, me personally, I would buy the 1050 Ti over the RX 560. However, prices vary around the world, deals and sales happen, and some people simply prefer AMD for a variety of reasons. The AMD RX 560 is a fine card. At $100, I think it's a better deal. At $115, I think it's a little bit too expensive compared to the 1050 Ti, but it's very much a personal choice. Both are linked in the video description below. Buy the one that you prefer. I hope this video was helpful to you. Click that like button, share this video with your friends. Remember to subscribe, post your comments below, check the video description for links to everything in this video, the computer I tested, the graphics cards, and everything. Please consider supporting me on Patreon. My link to Patreon is down there. This video was made possible by all of you contributing. Nothing in this video was provided by any company. I bought both graphics cards and the computer that you see off of both Newegg and Amazon myself. So if you can support me, that'll help keep me independent so I can keep giving you my honest and frank opinion about everything I review. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.